In the course of the First World War, mind-altering agents were used for both medical and non-therapeutic purposes, and they were issued by the authorities as well as self-prescribed by soldiers. Sedative drugs such as alcohol, morphine, Snow White, and opioids helped soldiers to subdue the physical and emotional pain and to relax and alleviate the horrors of combat, but not without a cost. This was a time before drug regulation and awareness, and things could not have been different than any other war that followed. Welcome to Nutty History. Today, let's find out what drugs were like in the Great War of 1915 to 1919 and how it helped people. When it comes to pain relievers, sadly, little had changed in the time between the American Civil War and the beginning of the First World War. The art of analgesics was still all about morphine, as the controversial narcotic was routinely administered to subdue the pain of the wounded. And there was no end to the number of casualties among the servicemen. Shrapnel from exploding shells was ripping flesh and shattering bones, causing ghastly wounds to the kidney, lungs, and bladder, as well as facial mutilations. Injuries like these caused agonizing suffering, torment that could only be countered by the most potent analgesic, morphine sulfate, aptly named after the Greek god of sleep, Morpheus. But morphine is not a narcotic to be taken lightly, pun intended. During the initial treatment and dressing of wounds, frontline medics mark patients' foreheads with crosses in permanent ink after administering the morphine, in order to prevent drug overdose at further stages of medical care. A widely accepted recommended dose was 1/4 of grain or 16 milligrams. But despite all precautions, patients were mistakenly issued the narcotics more than once, and the badly injured were deliberately giving larger amounts to ease their very severe pain. Due to the chaos caused by the war, it was simply proving to be near impossible to avoid such mistakes. On top of that, the wounded self-medicated themselves with morphine while awaiting professional aid. One of the downsides of a morphine overdose was the drug obscuring the clinical picture and hampering a proper diagnosis. Often, the personnel at clearing stations and hospitals could not determine whether a patient's condition resulted from the excessive intake of morphia or his wounds. The concerns over persisting morphine addiction and overconsumption in military infirmaries had a bunch of physicians arguing that patients would be better off to undergo the pain until they reached advanced treatment stations. Perhaps the most famous of these patients-turned-morphinist was a fighter pilot ace and later powerful member of the Nazi elite and commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring. Yet, as no equally potent alternative was available, morphine remained the preferred choice for pain relievers. But this was the day and age when opioids not only ruled the analgesics but were also the preferred method to make babies sleep peacefully at night. And that was a generation called the Greatest Generation. We're not even joking. Morphine was also used for euthanizing soldiers who were maimed beyond recovery, and a lethal injection was the only way to put them to rest. A British private, recalling heavy casualties in the Battle of Aubers Ridge in May of 1915, remembered a man who had no eyes, no nose, no chin, no mouth, and yet he was alive. As the medicine was not advanced enough to deal with such horrendous casualties, a 4-fold humanitarian dose of morphine was administered to put victims out of their misery, but often doctors and sergeants would lack the courage to do the necessary thing, and they had to rely on nurses and privates. Other analgesics used in World War I, apart from morphine sulfate, were sodium salicylate and opii tinctura camphoratum. Morphine sulfate was also a popular solution for anesthetic along with good old chloroform and goprelto. Goprelto, for the unaware, is the hydrochloride salt form of the tropane alkaloid Snow White, with central nervous system stimulating and local anesthetic activity. Yes, the same Snow White that grows naturally in cocoa leaves in South America and is responsible for the rise of some of the biggest narcos of the last 50 years. But back in the First Great War, Taxi was thundering through the trenches. In the 19th century, Europeans discovered the Andean people's secret of using the cocoa leaves for physical endurance. Once Snow White was isolated from cocoa leaves in 1859, a German pharmaceutical company, Merck of Darmstadt, launched its manufacture and marketing in 1862. Interestingly, back then, Aunt Nora was described as a stimulant, that in a particular way adapted to elevate the working ability of the body without any dangerous effect. The concerned narcotic was tried in the military for the first time in 1883. Theodor Askenbrandt, the Bavarian army physician who carried out these experiments, recognized the potential utility of the drug and its appetite-suppressing effect and supposed that it could help reduce army food supplies by up to 20%. This and the stimulating properties of Snow White were the reasons why the drug was so widely used in the Great War. When war broke out, Colombian Blow was easily available at pharmacies in Europe and America, both as a sold medicine and as an ingredient in many popular medications and tonics used for runny nose and coughing. In fact, one of the most popular American medicines, Rhino's hay fever, was nothing but pure Snow White. Back in the day, tobacco and happy powder were considered equally harmless. Oh, how wrong our great-grandparents were. Apart from being used as a local anesthetic, Snow White was issued by the military authorities for enhancement purposes. Soldiers could even purchase it by themselves if they felt the need for it. It was so widely common that the rate of its consumption by fighting men remains unknown, and there is no way to estimate the figures. The drug was the morale booster, the fuel for the inner fire, and the overall mood enhancer in the trenches. It helped soldiers calm down, focus, and improve performance. The drug was taken during long-distance flights by German fighter pilots, and as French records revealed, early airmen were particularly keen on the stimulant. The drug helped air duelists to make use of the cold up there by fortifying them against it. However, the popularity of the Colombian drug was far more intense in infantry than airmen. The German Army Command planned at the dawn of war to issue each of its soldiers daily rations of Snow White to decrease their appetite and increase stamina. The only reason that this ridiculous idea was abandoned was that there was not enough supply of the drug in question. The British, on the other hand, were also distributing the drug under the code name Forced March and issued it in the form of a gelatin-coated pill. Along with Snow White, this little bugger also had cola nut extract to bring out the flavor of the blow. The famous store Harrods was offering smaller sets of morphine and Snow White with syringes and needles. It was advertised in the Times as a useful present for friends at the front, while well-known pharmacy Savory & More was selling a mail-order medical kit containing Snow White and Smack. The acceptance for Lady Snow didn't last for the entire war. While France was accusing Germany of smuggling the happy powder into French cities and trenches to subvert their war efforts, there were wide protests against the use of the drug in Britain as well. The media and politicians of Britain were fueling a nationwide drug scare against the Colombian Blow and had branded the narcotics deadlier than the enemy bullets. This hysteria was the outcome of a Canadian major discovering in 1916 that a London-based escort and her agent were supplying the Blow to his units. The investigation revealed that some 40 men in a local camp had developed an addiction. The incident, highly publicized, worked in favor of the proponents of introducing tight governmental control of habit-forming drugs. The case provided a convenient pretext for launching the anti-drug campaign, which found fruitful soil in the nation's wartime anxieties and suspicions. By late 1915, Merck experienced a dramatic fall in the annual production of white gold down to merely 447 kilograms, compared to nearly 9,000 kilograms in 1913. The war had interrupted international trade and impeded the supply of European factories with Peruvian cocoa leaves. With politicians and media drawing on paranoia, the moral panic regarding the Blow created a general movement against drugs. On May 11, 1916, the Army Council of Britain issued an order banning any unauthorized sale or supply of psychoactive substances to any member of the armed forces, except for medical reasons and only by prescription. On one hand, World War I facilitated greater consumption of narcotics like Snow White and morphine, but it also paved the path for comprehensive national substance control regimes. It may not have been able to entirely abolish the use of drugs in warfare, as evident by the use of amps in the Second World War and smack in the Vietnam War, but it sure was the first step to recognize and address the ill effects of such substances on soldiers. Tell us in the comments, which other war would you like for us to cover in this series? And as always, thanks for watching Nutty History. The Art of War, Sun Tzu wrote that speed is the essence of war. Surely, when Sun Tzu wrote that, he was not expecting Hitler to take it too literally. Speed, also known as amps, pep pills, uppers, and lid poppers, was commercialized just in time for mass consumption during World War II by the leading industrial powers. World War II was truly the greatest impetus to date for legally medically authorized as well as illicit black market abuse of amps and similar drugs on a worldwide scale. Welcome to Nutty History, and today, let's find out how pep pills control the tides of battles during the Second World War. There is no doubt about the worldwide abuse of large amounts of brain ticklers by the Japanese, American, and British forces during World War II. But the trend was established by the Germans during the initial phases of the war, long before others joined the bandwagon. While Nazi ideology was fundamentally anti-drug and social use of drugs in Nazi Germany was considered both a sign of individual weakness and moral decay of the entire society, they had no qualms about being hypocritical to abuse drugs in the military. In fact, the Nazi propaganda promoted black beauties as a privilege offered only to the soldiers. While other drugs were banned or discouraged, speed was touted as a miracle product when it appeared on the market in the late 1930s. The little pill had a poetic connection with the Nazi slogan, Germany Awake, as it would energize and boost the confidence of the soldiers. That played right into the Third Reich's obsession with physical and mental superiority. While other drugs, such as alcohol or white junk, were sort of an escapist delight, amps were helpful with hyper-alertness and vigilance. We've already discussed in our older videos how much armies were obsessed with the mythical concept of super soldiers during the Second World War, and bumblebees also contributed to that fascination. The lightning oranges were considered a small shortcut to turn ordinary soldiers into superhumans. As Hitler declared, "We don't need weak people, we want only the strong," and thus the abuse of speed became a synonym with being strong and getting stronger. However, the blame for introducing speed to Germany goes to U.S. athletes of the Berlin Olympics in 1936. The German chemist Friedrich Hochschild had been aware that Americans were using Benzedrine, an American version of Pixies, for doping during the 36 Olympics. Benzedrine was also used by U.S. forces during the Second World War, especially by the Air Force pilots to stay up in the air for longer hours. Discovering American speed led Friedrich Hochschild to research into the drug, and he managed to synthesize a close cousin of amps. This drug later would become the center plot of a great TV show in the early 21st century, where a cancer-ridden teacher would join hands with a good-for-nothing student to become the underworld king. At that time, Friedrich Hochschild was working for Daimler-Werke, a Berlin-based pharmaceutical company. Daimler-Werke came up with a brand name for this fascinating chemical in the winter of 1937 and called it Pervitin. Thanks to the company's aggressive advertising campaign, Pervitin became well known within a few months. The tablets were wildly popular and could be purchased without a prescription in pharmacies. One could even buy chocolates spiked with speed. But the drug's most important use was yet to come. From 1939 to 1945, the Third Reich astonished Europe with its blitzkrieg on all battlefronts. Its military efficiency has since then become a leitmotif of history studies. Although academically, Nazi success in this period has been attributed to its technological superiority, optimization, and innovative strategies, there was more to that, though. The Wehrmacht had nothing left to chance. Everything was meticulously and accurately calculated, from the weight of the firearms to the offensive timings, as well as when and how to abuse performance-enhancing drugs. Throughout the war, the Germans consumed Pervitin. It produced higher energy and reduced sleep needs and hunger. It was also attributed to sparking great enthusiasm and made soldiers believe the Nazi propaganda was all rainbows and unicorns. Pervitin enjoyed a legal status in Germany until 1941, and until then it was broadly advertised all over the nation. Billboards were strewn throughout Berlin from 1938 to its regulation in 1941 as consumption became more and more obscure. According to Norman Ohler's book, Blitzed, Drugs in Nazi Germany, the entire nation was once dependent on speed at one point. It may be a matter of ridicule now, but Pervitin was never meant to be a military drug for the Nazis, but it was intended to compete with the American beverage popular in Germany called Coca-Cola. Timler employed Mathis and Son with the advertising campaign of their new casual drug. Germany was going through a calamity back then. The embarrassment of the defeat in the First World War, the humiliating Treaty of Versailles, economic crisis, political turmoil, the rise of nationalist rage, and blaring bugles for another great war. All of that didn't make it easy to cope for an average German citizen. And here came Pervitin, offering vigor, efficiency, and calmness so the population welcomed the energizing substance with open arms. It was cheap, helped people work, spread euphoria throughout the country, and was not even considered a drug at the time. Furthermore, the drug was not only popular among workers. Adolf Hitler himself was introduced to drugs by Morell. Soon, the drug was issued a performance test on students to see how it would affect their focus and work behavior. Otto Ranke, director of the Institute for General and Defense Physiology at Berlin's Academy of Military Medicine, soon returned with the conclusion that the drug indeed could bolster German efforts on the front. He suggested that speed and its compounds could improve the soldiers' performance. Following the research conducted under the spearhead of Otto Ranke, Pervitin was introduced in the daily rations of the Nazi soldiers and was to be consumed up to twice a day. The drug soon began showing its effects. The soldiers were acting fearless and were extra elated even in the most morbid situations. Otto Ranke's goal to defeat the enemy with chemically enhanced soldiers was now a reality. The soldiers were walking up to 60 kilometers and working nonstop for 3 days without sleeping. This was the biggest aid that helped the invasion of Poland in 1939, the Blitzkrieg through the French Ardennes in 1940, and the Balkan Campaign of 1941, where Germans fought unceasingly for 11 days. Otto Ranke was over the moon with the success of his little find and had become a daily user of the drug himself. He was living the dream of Nazi grandeur of world domination and seeing himself next to Hitler in no time. His correspondence indicates that he and his desk workers, too, were working without any sleep and popping pills left and right, ignoring the prescription limit to manage the self-inflicted demands of their jobs. Before playing a crucial part in the invasion of Poland, the drug was given a test run by the Wehrmacht medical officers. They ordered soldiers of the 3rd Tank Division to take it during the occupation of Czechoslovakia in 1938. The success there cleared the path for widespread military use in the Poland invasion that caused the death of over 100,000 Polish soldiers. This was the moment when the term Blitzkrieg or the Lightning War came into existence. Being high on speed allowed German soldiers to emphasize haste and surprise to catch the enemy off guard and trample over them. Pervitin eliminated what differentiates humans from machines: fatigue. The need for rest, sleep, and eat was a tale of the past now, and nothing was slowing down as tanks and companies of men marched together at an unrelenting pace to win all of Europe for Der Fuhrer. However, Pervitin wasn't a miracle. It was just burning candles from both ends. Nothing in his universe was as benevolent as Pervitin was promising to be for Hitler's Germany. The drug obviously had its side effects. Early reports found in the archives mention adverse effects such as exhaustion, heart pain, and circulation problems. This instigated further study led by the Reichsfeldführer Leonardo Conti, who among others soon sounded the alarm bells about the risk of Pervitin, and that led to its regulation and prohibition in 1941. The drug was now available through prescription only, but these warnings fell on deaf ears. Despite the anti-drug rhetoric of Hitler and the Nazi Party that had been disseminated since 1933, the new regulations were widely ignored. They had a perfect reason for it, too. All of Germany was hooked on Pervitin, and sudden prohibition caused a large national withdrawal. Ironically, Hitler himself was heavily addicted. Instead of causing the reduction of the German economic dependence on pharmaceuticals and tackling an alarming addiction problem, the prohibition was deemed pretty much a failure, even on the civilian front. The military didn't even care for the prohibition or regulation. As a matter of fact, military officials seemed to find its distribution legitimate, especially due to the short-term benefits it was providing the army. The consumption increased during the ill-fated Operation Barbarossa from June to December of 1941, immediately after the restrictions were imposed. There's also a conspiracy side of the regulation. German civilians getting hooked on Pervitin could have been considered an unnecessary stress on the production of speed pills. So it's entirely possible that the sham of prohibition was created just to ensure more supply to the soldiers who were about to face the Red Army on their home turf. From 1941, the Reich knew that Pervitin brought side effects and risk of addiction. However, even when the soldiers were dying because of heart failure or committing suicide because of the psychotic phases, the amps continued to fuel the country until the end of the war. The Blitzkrieg depended on speed, for relentlessly pushing ahead with tank troops, day and night. It was the cause of the fall of Denmark and Norway in 1940. Within a month, the Nazi army, high on speed, annexed Holland, Belgium, and finally France. When they crossed into France, the French reinforcements had yet to arrive, and their defenses were overwhelmed by the German attack. German tanks covered 240 miles of challenging terrain, including the Ardennes forest, in 11 days. They also bypassed the entrenched British and French forces who had mistakenly assumed the Ardennes was impassable. Paratroopers sometimes landed ahead of the advance, causing chaos behind enemy lines. According to the British press, these soldiers were heavily drugged, fearless, and berserk like Vikings. Even Churchill confessed he was dumbfounded by the overrunning of the whole communications and countryside by an irresistible incursion of armored vehicles. He admitted in his memoirs that it was the greatest surprise of his life. The biggest downside of pervitin was dependence and addiction, of course. Providing soldiers with daily doses inevitably made them and their performance dependent on pervitin. And when the supply dried up, shortage and withdrawal caused chaos among German ranks. The symptoms included nausea, hallucinations, anxiety, depression, and diminution of cognitive capacities were rampant in German camps. Despite Conti's efforts to limit the use of pervitin, the army was obsessed with the drug and continued its abuse. The situation escalated over the years, and soldiers died increasingly from cardiac failure, death, or military miscalculations. The army wasn't controlling pervitin. It was pervitin controlling the army. In fact, Morell, who ironically introduced Der Führer Hitler to the drug, was also the one who revealed during interrogations how Hitler's own addiction to pervitin led to poor strategic decisions resulting in enemy victory at Normandy and ultimately the fall of Berlin. Wehrmacht's miracle drug shined brightly during the early years of the war, but also backfired and became the reason for the decline of the Third Reich. Himmler Vinke, the maker of the drug, were the only winners, making huge profits of relentless production. Tell us in the comments, how do you think the Second War would have been different without the use of pervitin? And as always, thanks for watching Nutty History. In the history of the U.S. Army, the Vietnam War saw a higher consumption of drugs than any other previous generation. In just 4 years, between 1966 and 1969, the active duty U.S. troops in Vietnam received 225 million doses of speed. This number of uppers was greater than pills consumed by all U.S. and British combat forces in World War II, combined. Welcome to Nutty History, and today, let's look back at what drugs were like during the Vietnam War. While President Nixon was declaring the war on drugs in 1971, according to a report, 51% of the armed forces deployed in Vietnam had smoked grass. 31% had consumed psychedelics such as Chinese dragons, mescaline, and psilocybin mushrooms, and an additional 28% were on hard drugs such as nose candy and dope. But these were the drugs that U.S. Army enlistees were illicitly buying from the black market. The statistics don't include the copious amount of heavily prescribed pills of speed distributed to them under the auspices of improving their performance. In addition to AMEs, which were used to boost endurance on long missions, heavy sedatives were also prescribed to help relieve anxiety and prevent mental breakdowns. And nobody intervened because it was working. The rate of mental breakdown in soldiers was down to 1% in Vietnam, which was a massive reduction in comparison to the Second World War, where about 10% of soldiers returned home shell-shocked. However, there were other side effects of these drugs. In his book Shooting Up, A Short History of Drugs and War, author Łukasz Kamiński argued that Jelly Baby's withdrawal could have alleviated the atrocities committed against Vietnam's civilian population. The Vietnam War was like a living hell for most of the troops, and strung-out young soldiers may have overreacted when dealing with civilians while coping with withdrawal issues. Yet, it was the use of illicit drugs in the Army that garnered headlines in the media back home and the rest of the world. Blazing helped some GIs take the edge off. China white, smuggled primarily by anti-communist assets in Hong Kong and the Golden Triangle, was cheap, plenty, and was pure enough to smoke. In his Public Enemy #1 speech, Nixon also blamed these illicit depressants for the not-so-unexpected outcome of the Vietnam War. Now, according to the experts on the use of drugs in the modern military, there were multiple reasons why illicit drugs flourished rampantly in American military camps in Vietnam. The first reason was obviously the availability. As soldiers invaded villages, the grass was easily obtainable, with a crate costing merely $5 or $6, or sometimes could be bartered for a few packs of cigarettes. It is believed that the use of doobies was tolerated in the military at first, and nearly 30% of GIs had tried out Aunt Mary at least once while being stationed in the Southern Corps. But that changed after the expose piece on the common use of buds among military troops, written by John Steinbeck IV for Washingtonian magazine, published in 1968. The media firestorm and hyperinflation of statistics forced the military to clamp down on the abuse of happy cigarettes. The scrutiny caused the arrest of nearly 1,000 GIs per week for possessing Mary J. A joint operation was also conducted with the South Vietnamese troops to search and destroy hundreds of weed-growing fields. The aftermath of this mission included 504,795 hemp plants being destroyed. These farmers were paid a small amount of money, less than 1 U.S. cent for every crop that was destroyed on their land. There's also speculation that this was a covert mission to weed out any guerrillas and push villagers into government-run camps so they could not help Charlies anymore. But this solution created another problem. Like a hydra, the drug problem reared a new head in response to cutting another. The consequence of cracking down on Mary Greens caused GIs to find a new love in the foreign land, the Big H. The Big H, or China White, was everything that laughing grass wasn't: odorless, more potent, and available through anti-communist assets. Buying from them was like supporting the American cause in the war. In 1970, the supply for smack began flowing from Cambodia to Vietnam in great quantities. GIs were able to hide Black Eagles clandestinely in their tobacco cigarettes and smoke them openly because of the lack of a distinct fragrance. According to a study, by 1973, up to 20% of soldiers were habitual hell dust users. The authorities were so desperate that they even considered sanctioning the use of Aunt Mary again to combat the Big H issues. An estimated 450,000 U.S. military forces in Vietnam were reportedly using or had tried galloping horses once. Because of the strict enforcement against smoking grass, China White literally knocked out all the competition that the drug could have. Big H was more readily available than buds had ever been. Now, at first, U.S. military responded to the drug abuse among troops harshly. Soldiers who were caught participating in drug activity were subject to court-martial and the possibility of a dishonorable discharge. As the crackdown spread through all camps, more and more troops were being sent back to the United States. Among other downsides of such disciplinary penalties was the fact that it created the risk of habitual users of illicit drugs, bringing these drugs back to the USA with them. As the impending fear of drug addiction on the home front became clearer and clearer, the U.S. Army was forced to drug test returning GIs to make sure the Black Eagle couldn't invade the home of the Star-Spangled Eagle. The whole process, titled Operation Golden Flow, was aimed at detecting as many different drugs as possible. But thanks to the media, the Big H became the highlight of the scrutiny. According to experts, an estimate of more than 2/3 of the returning GIs from Vietnam never even touched the horse once they returned home. However, under all of this hullabaloo of illicit drugs, a major issue subsided: the use of military prescribed drugs. The British philosopher Nick Land aptly described the Vietnam War as a decisive point of intersection between pharmacology and the technology of violence. Since World War II, little research has determined whether pep pills had a positive impact on soldiers' performance. Yet the American soldiers in Vietnam received ample speed, and they were not just any pep pills. According to veterans, U.S. troops had the best possible pixies available to them. Only the best for our troops. Doled out like candies, Dexedrine was almost twice as potent per milligram as the Greatest Generation's bennies. Clearly, Forrest Gump was nowhere close to the real super soldiers who marched through hellfire in Nam. The annual consumption of Dexedrine per person was 21.1 pills in the Navy, 17.5 in the Air Force, and 13.8 in the Army. Amy would give soldiers a sense of bravado while also keeping them awake. The sense of sight and sound were heightened, and often American soldiers were to believe that they were invincible. For instance, soldiers in units infiltrating Laos for a 4-day mission received a medical kit that contained 12 tablets of Darvin, a mild painkiller, 24 tablets of codeine, an opioid analgesic, and 6 pills of Dexedrine, among other items. Before leaving for a long and demanding expedition, members of special units were also administered steroid injections. According to studies conducted, nearly 3% of soldiers arriving in Vietnam were on a heavy dosage of bumblebees. But among the soldiers who spent more than a year in the battle zone, the numbers rose over 5%. Veterans of Nam War often blame the administration for developing their drug habits and tragic consequences, such as increased aggression in their behavior. Some remembered that when the effect of speed faded away, they were so irritated that they felt like shooting pedestrians in the streets. As we mentioned earlier, to counter the after effects of combat stress that was alleviated thanks to speed, soldiers were offered sedatives. Basically, they were taking more drugs to negate other drugs. The book On Killing by David Grossman described that the Vietnam War was the first war in which the forces of modern pharmacology were directed to empower the battlefield soldier. For the first time in military history, the prescription of potent antipsychotic drugs like chlorpromazine, under the brand name Thorazine, became routine. This helped to lower the numbers of mental breakdowns, which saw a substantial reduction in comparison to the numbers of the Second World War. But this was not the solution. As we all know, the aftermath of the Vietnam War on veteran psyche was long-lasting. Thorazine was a short-sighted solution. Just like insulin treats the symptoms of diabetes but not the disease, Thorazine was merely temporary relief. Moreover, drugs taken without proper psychotherapy only assuage, suppress, or freeze the problems that remain deeply embedded in the psyche. Yes, the antidepressant drugs help to reduce the number of soldiers requiring medical evacuation because of combat stress breakdowns. But, by the same token, the Army forces contributed to the unparalleled widespread outbreak of PTSD among veterans in the aftermath of the conflict. We still do not know precisely how many Nam veterans were suffering from PTSD, but the estimate could be anywhere from 40,000 to 1.5 million. Despite the political rhetoric of using heavy drug usage during the war as an excuse, experts found scant evidence to support the claim. A study in 1968 concluded that none of the illicit drugs contributed to the outcome of the war by any means possible. According to some experts, drug consumption by soldiers was more of a coping mechanism than in any way a performance enhancer or hindrance. Most soldiers only abused illicit drugs during the lulls in combat, resting, or while they were on recuperation leave. But whether these drugs made an impact in the war or not, they sure did leave an impact on America's history. Tell us in the comments if someone in your family was a Vietnam War veteran and if they shared an experience with you. And as always, thanks for watching Nutty History. Medieval Europeans believed in and feared many monsters. Basilisks, demons, dragons, also smart independent women, who they misbranded as witches.
I'm not a witch, I'm not a witch.
But you are dressed as one.
But unlike these made-up monsters, there was one nightmare that was very real and could actually hurt them: a Viking berserker. These raging Norse warriors were known to enter raids and battles with bloodthirsty anger, with madness like a dog, and the strength of a bear or bull. Their crazy tranced eyes, full of lust for blood, were enough to make their enemies lose all hope long before the first strike. However, their penchant for violence, gore, and killing wasn't just something inherent. Their blood dance looked like a trance-like state because they were actually high. Welcome to Nutty History, and let's talk about what drugs were used recreationally during the Age of Vikings. Vikings would perform blessing rituals before walking into battle or going for a raid. It's believed that during this ritual, berserkers would go into a self-induced hypnotic trance. They would lose conscious control of their actions, as their mind would act subconsciously in this dissociative state. People in this state seem remote, have little awareness of their surroundings, and have reduced awareness of pain and increased muscle strength. Despite losing their ability of their critical thinking and having a very little grasp on their social inhibitions, they would still be awake and rage into the battle. Scandinavia is home to many fungal plants, and so the common belief behind the savage bloodthirst of the mighty berserkers was thought to be the consumption of these mushrooms. It started in 1784. A priest named Odman proposed a theory that going berserk was a result of eating fly agaric mushrooms. One of the psychoactive compounds in fly agaric includes muscimol, which is a GABA receptor agonist, causing sedative, hypnotic, depressant, and hallucinogenic effects. Because GABA receptors are everywhere in the brain, muscimol alters neuronal activity in many regions, including the cerebellum, hippocampus, and cerebral cortex, mainly the regions responsible for emotions and higher executive thinking. The effects of muscimol start within 30 to 120 minutes and last for about 5 to 10 hours. Side effects include increased salivation, muscle twitching, tremors, and strong delirium, which all describe berserking. The fly agaric theory is still quite popular and widely accepted among the masses, but most experts find it implausible. Oddman based his hypotheses on reports about Siberian shamans, but he never tried the mushroom himself. If he had, he might have changed his mind. In addition to its hallucinogenic effects, eating agaric mushrooms can lead to depression and can make the user apathetic. Fly agaric is also quite poisonous and can cause nausea, vomiting, dizziness, hallucinations, involuntary movements, and seizures. White agaric could not be the cause of berserk fury either, due to the logic that it shares most of the poisonous effects of fly agaric and could put a person in a coma or outright kill a man. Another mushroom that may have been the cause of berserk fury was the fungus Claviceps purpurea, as it contains a compound used to synthesize the hallucinogen LSD or lysergic acid diethylamide. But Claviceps purpurea is also highly poisonous. However, the berserker trance was more like psycho-murder automatism, which in forensic psychiatry can be described as diminished responsibility. The high from that is followed by major emotional catharsis in the form of tiredness, exhaustion, and obviously long hours of sleep. Clearly, such practices of achieving abreaction of strong, aggressive, destructive, and sadistic impulses diminished after the introduction of Christianity, as such rituals and actions were and are considered demonic and thus were discouraged. So, if mushrooms were too stomach-churning for the strongest of Vikings, what was helping them achieve the trance of terror and tyranny? According to the findings of modern scientists, it might have been henbane. Henbane, or stinky nightshade, has propped up in many Norse burial grounds, including the grave of a berserker. Often considered as the crazy plant in much older civilizations, consumption of henbane can cause feelings of delirium, inhibition loss, and manic episodes. It also triggers visual disturbances, hallucinations, drowsiness, and red skin, making it the perfect match for what berserkers experience during their fury. Henbane also acts pretty well as a painkiller, as we mentioned in our video What Drugs Were Like for Ancient Romans and Greeks. Thus, it does fit the bill to help in reducing the sensation of pain among the no-armor-wearing Viking vanguards, who were known for being wild, unpredictable, and highly aggressive. Now comes the question, how do they consume henbane? Karsten Vertoer, an ethnobotanist at the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia, has very interesting theories about that. Instead of going with a conventional way of smoking it, he believes they might have infused it with alcohol, made an ointment out of it, and rubbed it on their body, or surprisingly, made an herbal tea out of it. We know what you're thinking. Savage berserkers and posh herbal tea do not go well together, especially on the eve of a battle or a raid. But it makes sense because henbane was also found in the grave of a sorceress in Denmark. Nordic sorceresses, or vulva as they were called, were sort of like ancient Greek oracles or sibyls who used hallucinogens to go into a trance-like state to see the future. Vulva worked in a quite similar fashion, but had more shaman-like flair about them. If anybody was making herbal tea out of henbane or stinky nightshade, it would be these ladies. But that doesn't mean henbane was a relatively safer choice than shrooms. Henbane has been used over the centuries as a sedative, a sleeping agent, and to induce hallucinations. The plant is deadly toxic, and even though people did use the plant, it was not at all harmless. So the toxicity had to be reduced because henbane contains hyoscyamin and scopolamine, two substances that have a strong narcotic effect on the nervous system. If the seeds are heated, the two substances evaporate and the vapors may act like a narcotic. This is how the Oracle of Delphi must have used it back in ancient Greece, and perhaps the tea vulva made in Scandinavia was more for inhaling than drinking and must have been served hot right off the pot. So then why is henbane preferred as a more plausible Viking drug over shrooms? Both the plant and the fly agaric mushrooms could have caused many of the symptoms described to berserkers, but according to Karsten Vertoer, agaric consumption doesn't give you the bloodlust like henbane may have. However, all of this study is still considered quite speculative, and some experts believe that berserkers' trance may have been totally natural and have nothing to do with recreational drugs. But they cannot deny vulva's involvement with henbane and perhaps cannabis as well. In 1903, a farmer stumbled upon an ancient Viking ship in Norway that contained many artifacts from the 800s AD. Among the artifacts were the skeletons of 2 women and a curious leather bag that contained cannabis seeds. These seeds are thought to be connected to one of those women, known as the Osper Queen. The Osper Queen was suggested to be the Queen Asa of the England clan, mother Halfdan the Black and grandmother of Harold Fairhair. Many archaeologists believe the woman was not just a secular queen, but also a priestess of Freya, the love goddess of Norse mythology. Archaeologists have believed that the cannabis seeds were used in rituals during this pre-Christian period in Scandinavia. Freya was associated with hemp sowing and harvest festivals across northern Europe, and often erotic rituals were held in her honor. It's thought that the feminine cannabis flower had erotic and love-generating powers, and that those who consumed these flowers would be imbued with the joy and seductive tendencies of the love goddess. Furthermore, Vikings were perhaps the first to take weed across the Big Pond as well. In August 2018, an archaeological team excavated a peat bog located nearly 100 feet east of the Viking settlement at Lons Meadows. They found a layer of ecofacts or environmental remains that may have been brought to the site by humans that were radiocarbon dated to the 12th and 13th century. These ecofacts included the remains of 2 beetles that were not from Newfoundland. Don't get your hopes up though, they were not John Lennon or Ringo, just some bugs from Greenland. Also, the other remains were pollens of walnuts and cannabis that also don't naturally grow at Lons Meadows. Vikings were regularly in and out of Newfoundland for about 200 years. The evidence of cannabis pollen matching their settlement time does indicate that it must be them who brought the green leaf to the Americas. However, there are still some doubts on this theory, but if not them, then who else? And that leaves us with opium. It is true that Vikings were aware of poppy and cultivated it in their Danish Viking Age kitchen garden. But was it used recreationally? Unfortunately, neither the Viking sagas nor archaeological excavations have given us an answer to that. But what do you think? Tell us in the comments about what other ages or civilizations should we cover in this series. And as always, thanks for watching Nutty History. Today, drug barons like Pablo Escobar and Griselda Blanco are known for revolutionizing the international drug trade. But if one wants to know who invented this trade, they would have to travel thousands of years back in time. Traces of drug trades between various early civilizations can be found as far back as 1600 BC. Welcome to Nutty History, and let's find out what ancient narcos were like in Greek and Roman civilization. The taboo around mentioning recreational drugs is nothing new in history. That's why there's not a lot of mention of this in ancient records, and those mentions are only a few. One will find historical mention of drugs mostly in medicinal and religious contexts. But what about for recreational purposes? Now that doesn't mean ancients were not a fan of being high as a kite, because there were more than a dozen ways to alternate reality for oneself. Thanks to advancements in archaeology, translation, and science in the last 2 decades, there is insight available on what drug abuse would have been like in ancient civilizations. The 2 drugs that stood out in the drug trade in ancient Greece and Rome were opium and cannabis. But at home, ergot was a drug of its own kind. The fungus called ergot has played a surprisingly stealthy but substantial role in the Salem witch trials, the French Revolution, and the Dancing Plague. Even back in ancient Greece, as far as 1600 BC, it is believed that a cult called Demeter and Persephone used ergot to induce visions. The goal was to awaken the Eleusinian mysteries. They convened at Eleusis in ancient Greece every year to perform secret religious rites at descending to Hades before returning to the living world and reuniting with Demeter, her mother and the goddess of fertility. To attain the Eleusinian mysterious, one was required to consume kykeon, a hallucinogenic beverage. Drinking ergot-laced kykeon was described as a spiritual progression, and they believed it unlocked the experience of death and rebirth. It's hard to conclude if ergot from locally grown barley was the active psychotropic ingredient in kykeon or not, but some historians point to it as a possibility for its vision-inducing qualities. There's a reason the term poppy appears a lot in fantasy novels written in modern times concerning medicinal and recreational usage. For ancient Romans and Greeks, it was certainly more than just a pretty plant, and it was perfectly legal. One can observe its prevalent use as a motif on statues and engravings to see how common poppy was popped by the population of Rome and Greece. See what I did there? Archaeologists have discovered that as early as 1600 BC, the ancient world was constructing small flasks in the shape of poppy capsules, that is, the bulging ball under the flower's petal that yields opium. It's not hard to guess why these flasks were made in such peculiar shape and what their function was, but thanks to forensic analysis, the residuals in excavated capsules have confirmed that these flasks were meant to carry not only opium, but a variety of psychoactive substances. Excavations have revealed that these jars and capsules were found throughout the Levant, Egypt, and the Middle East. The uniformity in design confirms that these were mass-produced under organized manufacturing units. It's believed that opium must have arrived in ancient Egypt through Mesopotamia and Egypt. Egypt was quite big on opium cultivation, and a number of varieties of Egyptian opium were available in ancient Greece. In the classical era, the extract of the plant was known as opium thebaicum, after the city of Wasit, which the Greeks knew as Thebes. Another version, opium cyrenaicaum, was a slightly different version of the plant that happened to grow to the west in Libya. Apart from importing a lot of opium, ancient Greeks grew their own as well. Dioscorides wrote about the opium harvesting technique in detail. He suggested that to make opium, farmers must wait until the dew has dried away to cut lightly with a knife around the top of the plant. They must take care not to cut the inside. Instead, cut straight down on the outside of the capsule. When fluid comes out, wipe it with a finger onto a spoon. Upon returning, one can harvest more of the residue after it has thickened, and yet more the following day. With the Romans, the usage of opium saw evolution. Citizens of Rome used opium-made Cretic wine as a sleep aid. For good times, they consumed meconium, a drink made of poppy leaves which could be considered as a watered-down version of the drug. Moreover, opium was not just legal, but easily accessible on the streets of Rome. It could be purchased as small tablets in specialist stalls in most marketplaces. Who says the past wasn't progressive? Just like today, back in ancient Greece and Rome, while some drugs in controlled use were legal, several drugs were actually illegal. In Capua, for example, drug sellers were found in a notorious area called Seplacia. The place had such a bad reputation that Seplacia became a synonym for mind-altering drugs, perfumes, and ointments. Drugs that were commonly found in such black markets were quite exotic and powerful. Dead nightshade was so trippy that it was often associated with pseudo-arts of magic and potion making. Some credit about relating deadly nightshade with mystical powers goes to the poet Ovid, who associated the herb with witches and warlocks in his poems. The reason this drug was not easily accessible was that even a slight excess of dosage could cause death. But if consumed in precise amounts, deadly nightshade was potent enough to cause hallucinations for days. Henbane was another drug that was notorious as a magical herb. No wonder it has another name, stinking nightshade, making it a little off-putting cousin of a deadly nightshade. It was commonly used as a medicinal drug rather than recreational. Henbane was the supplementary drug that serious junkies would consume along with a cocktail of an hallucinogenic to imitate the feeling of being drunk. The drug was consumed by both inhaling it and ingestion. Mad honey is a specific honey that is extracted from rhododendron flowers. The people of ancient Anatolia were the first to discover that neurotoxins in this specific honey caused altered consciousness, delirium, and nausea. One of the earliest accounts of mad honey comes from the Greek historian, philosopher, and commander Xenophon of Athens. In his chronicle, the Anabasis, he wrote that his army was traveling along the shores of the Black Sea in 401 BC when they decided to feast on some local honey. A few hours later, they became disoriented and began vomiting and had diarrhea. Now, in any case, this would have resulted in a plague. But to their surprise, the next day, the whole army was fine and they traveled back home to Greece. Unfortunately, the Roman army of Pompey the Great wasn't as lucky in 67 BC. During Pompey's invasion of the Black Sea region, his army got tempted by the mad honey's honeycombs strategically placed on the route by the locals. While 1,000 Roman soldiers feasted and got high on toxic honey, King Mithridates made short work of Pompey's invasion and sent them back home with their tails between their legs. As we mentioned earlier, drugs are often skipped in the existing historical records and literature from ancient Greece and Rome. However, there are rare cases when they are not only mentioned but also acted as an important element in the plot. Homer was specifically liberal about the depiction of drugs in the Odyssey. In one instance, he narrated how Helen of Troy liked to dope her wine with a happy drug that can take away her painful memories and bite of anger. Now, according to Homer, this drug was so potent that under its effect, one wouldn't feel any sort of sorrow, guilt, or remorse. Even if their family was murdered in front of them, one would still be calm and happy under the effect of this drug. There were also drugs that could be considered ancient performance enhancers. Performance enhancers have always been in demand among males throughout history. In Homer's The Odyssey, Odysseus had to drag his crew away from the land of the lotus eaters. There were no ordinary lotuses, but a specific breed called blue lotus. The psychoactive alkaloid in blue lotuses causes mild euphoria and tranquility combined with an increased libido. A perfect combination for having a great time in bed. No wonder those sailors were not happy about their king leading them away from such land. Interestingly, hemp was used as narcotics long before opium in Europe. The mysterious Yamnaya people of Central Asia brought it to Europe with them, and the plant has been in Northern and Central Europe for over 5,000 years. Hemp ropes and fabrics are used even to this day, but archaeologists also found braziers with burned cannabis, which shows that early Greeks were smoking hemp happily. The Greek physician Dioscorides was perhaps not so approving of cannabis and found it rather hampering when it comes to a consumer's sex life. He even recommended cannabis to reduce sexual desires for those who could not control their urges in inappropriate times. Roman philosopher Pliny the Elder called cannabis the laughing weed and suggested it as a toxifying ingredient for the wine on special occasions. Romans were actually quite fond of cannabis and called it the merriment supplement to make parties and social gatherings more fun. And if we are to believe Herodotus, Greeks didn't disagree about it either. Despite being very liberal about abusing narcotics, Greeks and Romans were also aware of their adverse effects. They knew very well what could happen in cases of overdosing, especially in the case of drugs like deadly nightshade. Dioscorides warned very bluntly in his writings that drugs will kill you if done excessively. However, there is another side to this story. Killing oneself was more accepted and normal back in those days. People would buy drugs specifically for these reasons. While opium was commonly used as sleeping pills, people would also mix poppy juice with hemlock to have an eternal sleep and never wake up again. That does put the whole free drug market scenario in a bad light, don't you think? Tell us in the comments, what do you think about Greek and Romans' love for drugs? Were they right to legalize it or not? And check out the stories of these modern world narcos on the screen to watch next. And, as always, thanks for watching Nutty History. Egypt and Mesopotamia were the forerunners of human civilization. These two places acted as the cradle of humanity and created the parameters of how to be a proper human for the world to follow. So when we talk about civilization, what are the key components of beginning one? Well, you need agriculture, systematic residence to accommodate a large population, art and education to define culture, social boundaries and expectations, and last but not least, narcotics. Yes, narcotics. Welcome to Nutty History, and today we're going to tell you all about the use and abuse of narcotics in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. Sit back and strap yourself in because this is going to be one trippy ride. About 12,000 years ago, humanity invented farming in the Fertile Crescent, an arc of highly fertile land from the Nile to the Tigris. Agriculture was most likely the first step towards civilization, and the second step was alcohol. As bizarre as it may sound, humans learn how to grow crops and they learn how to ferment them, creating a mind-altering substance out of them. For better or worse, psychoactive drugs have been an integral part of human culture and civilization from the beginning. But how did it begin? This was a peculiar mystery to the point that some archaeologists were in total denial of accepting the fact that eastern cradles of civilization, namely Mesopotamia, Egypt, Indus Valley, and China, were not as conservative as they once thought. In truth, these early civilized folks smoked anything they could lay their hands on. The first thing they smoked was most likely good old hemp. Thanks to nomads such as Yamnaya, everybody from Mesopotamia and Egypt to Greece and Rome got their hands on cannabis. Central Eurasia's Yamnaya people were a group of livestock herders who occupied the Eurasian steppe north of the Black Sea and the Caucasus Mountains and now are considered one of the three key tribes that founded European civilization. Around 5 millennia ago, they moved eastward and brought cannabis along with them. They spread the growth and use of cannabis all throughout Eurasia. However, just like any drug baron, Yamnaya's history is full of violence as well. These nomads are the reason why Stonehenge today is a mystery. When Yamnaya arrived in Britain 5,000 years ago, they wiped out the entire peaceful population of farmers who were the original Britons and builders of Stonehenge. The same fate befell upon many other original Europeans who vanished after Yamnaya's arrival. Yamnayans traveled on horseback from place to place in Europe and South Asia, bringing them the good old Mary J. Moreover, digs in the Caucasus have uncovered braziers containing seeds and charred remains of cannabis dating to about 3000 BC and older. However, the conservative faction of archaeologists still are not convinced. Their biggest issue with Yamnayans being the OG dope dealers of the Stone Age is that the ancient texts are pretty much silent on the matter of using hallucinogenic substances for recreational purposes. But that doesn't dismiss the archaeological evidence found, nor does it strengthen the theory that hemp was strictly used for making only ropes. Now let's talk about our Egyptians and Mesopotamians in more detail. Cannabis does have records of medical use in both Egypt and Mesopotamia. The only issue is that because these records are in a language and script that humans don't speak or read any longer for thousands of years, we don't have a clear understanding of how they referred to cannabis back in the day. Their records don't exactly say Mary Jane or 420. They use different names for their herbs. But there aren't many things that one can use to make brownies as well as a rope, right? Thankfully, a clay tablet from Assyrian times leaves very little to no debate about the medical use of cannabis. This tablet named a total of over 400 drugs, and a little detective work reveals that cannabis is shortlisted on it. Egyptians, on the other hand, offer much more concrete evidence of how fond they were of cannabis. Their detailed description of medical treatments in Ramesseum papyrus and Ebers papyrus depicted how popular cannabis was as a medical remedy. For glaucoma, cannabis was grounded with celery and left overnight. This preparation would then be used the following morning to wash the eyes of patients suffering from glaucoma, and it did work to a degree. Ebers papyri recommended cannabis be grounded with honey to be used as feminine remedies. Interestingly, cannabis is now being explored for its potential to treat menstrual pain and discomfort, as well as endometriosis. Cannabis has shown its presence in a lot of old Egyptian tombs and graves, including that of Pharaoh Ramses II, which proves that cannabis had an important role in Egyptian religion as well. Goddesses Seshat, the deity of wisdom, and Bastet, the feline goddess of war, had cannabis depicted in their lore and imagery. It was believed that this drug was also part of the profession of witchcraft. People also consume weed during certain rituals and festivities. This fact also indicates that if marijuana was a celebratory drug, it is undeniable that Egyptians and Mesopotamians also consumed it recreationally. For 8,000 years, opium was an ever-approved next-door medicine, a panacea for all maladies. Whether it be the Sumerian civilization, Egyptians, Chinese, Indians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, medieval times, or the Renaissance era, opium was used for medicinal purposes, rituals, and of course, recreation all over the world. In our last video, we talked about how popular poppy capsules were in ancient Greece and Rome. We also mentioned how opium made its way from the East to Europe in the form of small flasks that even resemble the shape of poppy capsules. More excavations unearthed ancient ceramic pots with the nearly identical shape of the flask that were about 5 inches long. They were discovered in tombs and settlements throughout the Middle East, dating as far back as 1400 BC. However, the Mesopotamians were taking advantage of opium long before other civilizations. Some researchers do not doubt that Assyrians were aware of the plant's properties and knew exactly what its secrets were. Even the Assyrian name of the poppy was Hulgil, meaning happy plant. Long before Assyrians, Sumerians engraved tablets in 4000 BC to 3000 BC describing the collection of poppy juice in the morning and its use in the production of opium. Jugs containing opium residue have also been found in Egyptian tombs, which is unsurprising given that the poppy was extensively cultivated in Egypt. In the classical era, the extract of the plant was known as opium thebaiacum, after the city of Wasid, which the Greeks knew as Thebes. Another version was named Opium cyrenaicaum, a slightly different version of the plant grown to the west in Libya. The Egyptians cultivated Opium thebaiacum in famous poppy seeds around 1300 BC. The opium trade flourished during the reign of Thutmose IV, Akhenaten, and King Tutankhamun. It was traded from Egypt by the Phoenicians and Minoans to destinations around the Mediterranean Sea, including Greece, Carthage, and Europe. By 1100 BC, opium was cultivated in Cyprus, where surgical quality knives were used to score the poppy pods, and opium was cultivated, traded, and smoked. Opium was also mentioned after the Persian conquest of Assyria and the Babylonian lands in the 6th century BC. The use of opium was generally restricted to priests, magicians, and warriors. Its invention is credited to Thoth, and it was said to have been given by Isis to Ra as a treatment for a headache. But that doesn't mean that opium wasn't for domestic use. In fact, it was the recommended way to deal with noisy, sleepless babies. Can't make your baby fall asleep? Just give them a draft of opium. Shockingly, this practice remained in use till the Victorian era in Europe. People in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia ate opium instead of smoking it like a lot of people eat morphine today for a bad cough, aches, and pains. Before Egypt was introduced to hemp or poppy, they had blue lotus. The stunningly beautiful flower growing along the banks of the Nile was perhaps the introduction to narcotics for ancient Egyptians. Also known as the sacred blue lily of the Nile, blue lotus has been revered by many ancient cultures and civilizations from ancient Egypt to the ancient Greeks, Tibetans, and more. Back in time, religion, magic, and medicine had very little distinction, as ancient Egyptians heavily believed that all parts of life were influenced and even controlled by divinity and the supernatural. The ancient Egyptians had many traditional uses and applications for blue lotus. The flowers of blue lotus were steeped in wine, which was then shared during religious ceremonies, rituals, and celebrations. Blue lotus was said to have the powers to connect one to the divine. It would induce higher states of being and consciousness. To give you a better understanding, blue lotus taken in excessive quantities would create a super-duper high. It would also induce a state of euphoria, make them feel relaxed with improved blood circulation, making it a potent aphrodisiac. The ancient Egyptians were liberal when referring to sexuality. The blue lotus helped them to create rituals and celebrations around sexuality. There are countless depictions of these famous celebrations, and blue lotus is a central symbol within each of them. Blue lotus is also mentioned in the Egyptian Book of the Dead as the lily which shines in the earth. Today, the blue lotus flower is used as a sleep aid and anxiety reliever, but has also been described as a mild stimulant. So, what do you think? Did Egyptians and Mesopotamians surpass your expectation with their junkie level? Would you like us to cover drug habits of any other era? Tell us in the comments. And, as always, thanks for watching Nutty History.